Okay, as people are signing on, we'll wait for just a few moments for the call to populate. Okay, I think we're underway now. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I'd like to welcome you all to our monthly journalism webinar. Today we're talking about science journalism, going beyond the data. We've got some great speakers for you this morning into the afternoon, and I want to just apologize in advance as I am going to be moderating this discussion, and you won't have the opportunity to hear from our esteemed Director of Communications, Nina Sachdev. She's under the weather today. We're still waiting for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute to cure all human ailments, and still dealing with stomach bugs and flus and colds. And until we resolve that, we have to adapt as necessary. So I'm going to moderate today's discussion, and it's easy work really for here because we've got such great speakers on important topics to share with you today. We're going to hear about a lot of different aspects of science. This webinar fits into a group of webinars that we've done on science, health, and the environment. We've focused on particular issues of the environment. Also, will be upcoming in a few months. We're going to do a special webinar on health issues as well. So particularly in this fiscal year of programming, where we are focusing a lot of our energies around climate and the environment, there's a strong science thread that's running through all of our programming as well. So today we're going to hear first from Rich Stone, who is Senior Science Editor at Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Tangled Bank Studios, and he's going to be joined with Jonathan Fahey, Health and Science Editor at the Associated Press. HHMI has supported important work at the AP, and we're going to hear from both of them. So if I could just, and before we go to Rich and John, I just want to encourage everyone to have questions for our speakers. You can offer your questions by going to the top left of your screen. You should find a Q&A function there. We'll monitor the questions throughout. We can have some brief questions after each speaker if we have them, and then we'll have a time for larger, broader Q&A toward the end of the call. And I also always encourage our speakers to have questions of each other too. Feel free to do that if any questions come to them. But at this point, I want to turn to Rich Stone from HHMI to get us started.
All right, thank you very much, Vince, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk about the media partnerships that Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education have started. It's a relatively new facet of our operation. But to backstep a bit, I want to explain why we're doing this. The Department of Science Education founded a documentary film studio called Tangled Bank Studios in 2012. And it's all about storytelling, about inspiring people on the latest science news. So, but we realized that documentary films are really preaching to the choir. How can you raise scientific literacy, try to infuse this wonder and awe about science in that broader population who might not tune into our films? And that's the philosophy behind our media partnerships. Our main media partnership is with the Associated Press, which John Fahey will shortly discuss. We have a few others that I'm going to briefly touch on right now. One is with The Atlantic. It's called Life Up Close. We're in our second year with The Atlantic on that project. For each year, we have supported 20 feature stories, and it allows The Atlantic to dispatch top-shelf freelance writers to any part of the world on great reporting trips, fascinating stories, and we added some videos for the second year of that project. We're in the middle of the second year with them. Another media partnership that we have is with Science Friday. Now, Science Friday, as you know, is a radio program, but we've supported the development of videos for their website. And it's a video series called Breakthrough Portraits of Women in Science. So they produced 6 videos in 2012, posted to their website, to other channels. And we were so thrilled with how they turned out that we renewed Science Friday for a second series of videos that are in production now and are going to air next September. In addition to that, there's going to be campus outreach events and other ways to spread the word there. Our newest media partnership is with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. It's a climate change reporting initiative called the Connected Coastlines. And we announced a call for proposals under Connected Coastlines in June, and a couple months later, there were a selection of newsrooms, mostly big-time collaborations that reporting various aspects of climate change on the U.S. coastlines. So not just sea level rise, but any factor which can be affected. And some wonderful stories have been rolling out. The Seattle Times, I think, was first out of the gate with a look at how climate change is affecting fisheries in the Northern Pacific. So those stories are both run in the newspapers that the Pulitzer Center is reporting and also posted to the Pulitzer Center's website. I think what I'll do now is take a little break and allow John Fahey to talk about the AP partnership.
Thanks, Rich. I'm John Fahey, and I'm the Health and Science Editor, and we are the great beneficiaries of this partnership collaboration with HHMI. We have AP obviously has a global reach and a global footprint, but we budgets are tight. It's very difficult to do all the reporting and do it with the rigor that we want to on all stories, and we have been able to hire more people, most importantly, to help us cover science and the environment and health. We have skills that we didn't have before. We have videographers, a data journalist, motion graphics animators to help us with explainers, and traditional reporters to help us cover subjects and areas that we hadn't been able to before. In all, we have about a dozen extra people on our team that we didn't have before, and it's allowed us to do more stories, the daily journalism that is the AP and that our customers and members need from us, along with larger projects that we've been able to really sink our teeth into and cover in all formats, and really do a comprehensive job on. I'm going to share my screen here in a moment and show you the project that we just now wrapped up. It was an environment conservation project. It was a 12-week, weekly 12-week series called What Can Be Saved, that looked at efforts around the world to preserve or restore ecosystems that were either under threat or ruined by human activity. And we, our health and science team did get bigger with the collaboration with HHMI, but we also used that money to help. We reported this story with AP people around the world, not necessarily in our department. We were in 10 countries on 5 continents, and we used a total of 33 AP journalists. I'm about to share with you the my screen. Let's see if this works. So this is the landing page. Each of the stories had text, photos, and video that go to our traditional clients and customers, broadcasters, newspapers, etc. But we also did longer form videos, mini docs. Here's our YouTube landing page. In all, they were seen well north of 1 million times. There's the 12 episodes. Here's what it looks like on in Zoom. There's a little beat on our AP-owned platform. This is about the story, as you can see, about China trying to build a national park system. Incredible photos and reporting from Tibetan Plateau. Pretty hard to actually climate in China right now. And here's on our photo blog, we were in Rwanda looking at just what it took to make this turnaround, the mountain gorilla population happen, the intense conservation that it took to make that happen. And this is our first episode. That's a coral garden, just a stunningly beautiful place where they're trying to grow coral to restore coral reefs. And I'll just quickly show you how our customers use our work, whether it's a big project like this. Here's sometimes it's big customers like the Washington Post. We were in the Eastern Congo reporting on the Ebola epidemic, and the Washington Post used our photos to make a photo essay. I'm going to share quickly some smaller examples of newspapers, to Rich's point of getting science journalism in front of people who aren't necessarily looking for a documentary. Here's a small paper with our story about that we collaborated with HMI on a new find of fossils in Colorado. We have a series of explainers called Science Says. Here's a paper in Washington, running a science, an explainer about how DNA mutations work. These are basic science stories sometimes that members, our AP members, small papers, broadcasters are using. Who knows what else would have been in that hole, that news hole, had we not done that. So that's the kind of, I'll stop sharing my screen now, but that's an overview of kind of the work we've been able to do with more people and more expertise with this funding. I'll happy to answer any questions, I believe, later in the program or now, whatever you guys like.
So, Rich, did you want to take it back at all and offer any further thoughts on the particular connection with AP and your rationale for supporting the science communications there, or take questions as well?
Yeah, just briefly, certainly I can take questions, but the Associated Press collaboration, it just underscores the fact that in documentary film, for instance, a single hour of broadcast time, if we make a 1 hour film, the cost of the film is upwards of $1 million. And how can we leverage our funding to reach a much broader audience? So that is how the AP, with their incredibly big reach, I mean, John can comment on the numbers of people around the world who receive AP stories each day. It's massive. It's like half the global population, essentially. How spending on journalism, science journalism, can reach a much broader audience than our films ever possibly could.
Mm-hmm. Great. We certainly know that even with the decline of the newsrooms around the country, there are still hundreds of environmental reporters, and it is, I think, in terms of pound for pound return on investment, the reporting is a great place to support powerful environmental journalism for media philanthropy. I wonder if either of you want to just maybe talk about the challenges associated with delivering science content across platforms, print, audio, video. Is there a translation challenge or just a production challenge, Rich or John?
I'm happy to comment on that from a news perspective. Yes, there is a challenge for sure. You know, I would say without question, video news is the heart. So for us, for every science or health medical story, ideally we want a patient. But if we don't want a patient, we want the researcher, and we want outside commenters who can help us. You know, we're not just going to take the researcher at their word. We need to report it out. So in text, we can call people, and the expert is in the study author is in Austin, and the outside expert is in Boston. And ideally, we make the story come alive with a person, a patient, for example, and maybe the patient is at a hospital in Seattle. And maybe we know about this new research, you know, that's coming out in a medical journal. Maybe we know about that 2 or 3 days in advance. Okay, so text, no problem. In fact, photos really aren't a problem. But how to get, you know, all three people, busy people, on camera and achieve the balance that the AP requires, the rigor and balance that the AP requires into a video on short notice and, you know, into a couple minutes. That for sure, that's the logistic challenge. I don't know if you want that kind of see how.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think it's the special capability of a large scale operation like the AP. And not every small newsroom will have all the capabilities to translate across format.
Yeah, I suppose I shouldn't complain. At least we have people in Seattle and Austin, to help. Right. It's still they're fully employed doing the stories in the regions. But I'll stop.
And I think we're so used to thinking of the AP as a resource that we experience through the commercial press that we might lose sight of the fact that the AP itself is a long-standing nonprofit news organization, correct?
Yes.
So that's important to keep in mind. We have one question from the audience. Kishore Hari, who is with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, says, how are you measuring the effectiveness of the AP partnership? Is it purely through audience metrics like views or beyond?
I think that's my question, right? So these partnerships are pretty new, and we have an evaluations person here at HHMI, Department of Science Education, who is now just trying to wrap her arms around how best to assess our very different partnerships. I mean, with the AP, it's a major partnership funding a number of positions, whereas with the Atlantic and Pulitzer Center and Science Friday, it's for project-specific journalism. So it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, but yes, we do want to evaluate. We want to go beyond our gut feeling that the story production of AP, getting science journalism out on a daily basis to a broad audience. We know that that's a great thing, but how to quantify it, I think that's next for our staff here.
Great. Thank you for that. I will just say that for anyone who's thinking about these questions, we have been following it for many years now through an area of work we call tracking media impact, or as we like to say, TMI. And so each month we have a newsletter on tracking media impact. And we're very soon going to be releasing a new report that's sort of a look at the state of the field. Actually, Nina Sachdev is working on final editing of that report. So we'll be having that out in a month or so. So stay tuned for more sort of broad view information for impact assessment. And now we're going to turn to Indre Viscontas. People like Indre were put on the earth to make the rest of us feel small and unproductive. She's a remarkable person who's doing work both in the creative space and in the scientific space. Maybe she makes both of them creative. In addition to being a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and currently on the faculty of the University of San Francisco. She's also an opera singer, a master's in voice, and has a faculty position at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music as well, and a great opera singer. If you YouTube follow her, there's great music to be heard as well. But today she's going to talk about her podcasting with Inquiring Minds, where she talks to brilliant scientists and helps them make sense of the work they do and share it with the world. So, Indre, thank you very much for making time to speak with us.
Thanks, Vince. Sorry, I apologize. I have a bit of a cold, so my voice isn't quite as clear as usual. But so Inquiring Minds is a weekly long-form interview format podcast. And the idea is that we want to be a part of people's weekly habits. So we release on Mondays, and we think that most of our listeners probably listen to our podcast every week at some part during their commute or some other sort of weekly thing that they do. It's a little bit like eavesdropping into a conversation between two scientists. And we are accessible in the sense that we always try to avoid jargon and we explain things, but we also give scientists the opportunity really to go into more depth about their work than a lot of shorter format podcasts and radio programs allow for. Our podcast is really trying to explore the space between science and society. So we try to pick topics that are important for people in terms of their own personal decision making. Like what can you do to make yourself more productive, with science telling you what are the best, most effective ways, or, when it comes to issues of the environment, if we're talking to a climate scientist, for example, we'll always ask, what can the individual do? Give us one thing that they can do today to sort of change their impact. It started out as part of Mother Jones because my co-host at the time, Chris Mooney, who's now at the Washington Post covering the environment, was at Mother Jones, and we thought that this partnership would really help us kind of also within the framework of what Mother Jones was really interested in, building out their science. And that worked for a couple of years, and we established a good foundation, and then we found that we started to run up against some legal issues where Mother Jones is a big organization. It often is the subject of lawsuits. And so we often had to put our podcasts through their legal team when we covered slightly controversial topics. And that made it really difficult to get shows out on a weekly basis, especially in the kind of format that we have, which is, we have these long conversations, and sometimes they go in directions that are a little bit unpredictable. So we decided that it would be better for us to become independent, and if they're going to sue me, that's not as big a deal. I don't have the kind of personal income or liability that a place like Mother Jones does. So we have somewhere, I think, around 300 episodes in the can. We have about 8 million downloads across the catalog. So we have a pretty faithful listenership. And I think that that's what's allowed us to have some longevity, and that's why we continue to produce weekly shows. I have another podcast that I started, which is really the intersection of music and the brain. And I chose that topic and in a sense to sort of explore stories that were going to be much more produced, that it would include a lot more music, a lot of other sounds. And so I just want to highlight the difference between these two formats. So the long form interview format, which is lightly edited but not heavily produced, is supposed to be casual. So we don't edit out all the ums and likes and things like that. We want people to feel comfortable with us as if they're just literally eavesdropping in. Whereas the more cadence, which is my music podcast, which is more heavily produced, we want people to sort of sit down and kind of binge listen an entire season and take a deep dive into that particular topic, as opposed to it being part of their sort of weekly habit. So I think that those different formats are something to think about if you are considering funding a podcast, or one of your fundees is considering building a podcast. I often get asked for advice. People want to start a podcast, and because I've been actually podcasting now for almost 10 years, they would say, "Oh, well, me, what should I do?" And the short answer is that I always tell them that you really need to examine why it is that you think a podcast is the best format for whatever it is that you want to accomplish. It's very easy to record some audio and upload it online, but it's very hard to get people to listen to it. It's a very saturated space, and it's really hard for people to find you. And to be honest, the low quality audio that used to be okay, 5 or 6 years ago, is no longer passing muster with listeners for the long term. I mean, 1 or 2 times if you have a Skype interview, that might be okay, but generally the sound quality, if you want people to listen consistently, it needs to be higher quality, and so that's more expensive and requires more production. So there are 2 reasons why people start podcasts. One is to build an audience, which, as I mentioned, is really hard to do if you don't already have, say, a celebrity attached to the podcast or a built-in audience yourself. Or 2, spread the word about their topic or information, knowing that people will come and find them. And I think that can be a sort of more effective way of using the podcast as a format. So I encourage people to think about why and what their goals are and whether these are realistic, because to be honest, the average podcast has 141 listeners. So it's not huge, right? And to get into the top 10, top 1%, I mean, you need a lot more than that because there's so many more. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is why it's difficult to have scientists come and be interviewed. That's another topic that I get asked about, like how can we get scientists to be more comfortable on the mic or on camera? And the short answer there is that I think you really need a seasoned science communicator who knows what they're doing, because there is a subtle art to the interview. One of the things that I try to do is always allot more time than I need so that I have buffer space. And it's not that I'm going to use that entire time, but I have room so that I can warm up to the person can warm up to me. I can ask them questions that I know I'm not necessarily going to use, but I know will make them feel comfortable and will get them talking. And then also I have enough material from which I can pick the best bits. I also think that it's important to understand that scientists are always worried about who's listening, whether their funders are listening, whether their colleagues are listening. But it's important to tell them who the audience is and to get a sense of, the fact that it's probably non-threatening, but also that, there might be some backlash and sort of help them, prepare for that. But finally, I think that it's really important to get the scientists to talk about what they're most excited about, right? Because ultimately scientists go into science because they're curious, not because they want to make a lot of money or, have other goals. So I think that that's really kind of from the key is how can I get this person to talk about what nobody else asks them about because it's not part of their 2-minute pitch, but also gets them super excited. So I try to approach it as if it's a colleague-to-colleague interaction, one that is not going to turn off an audience that doesn't have that expertise in that particular area. So finally, the last question that I was asked to just speak briefly on is how do we engage with a public that normally doesn't engage? And the answer there is that, podcasting maybe is not then the best format because it is an embarrassment of niches, right? So podcasts really are about getting people to listen in their particular niche, and they become loyal once they find you, and that's really the wonderful part of it. But I don't think that you can have a podcast unless it's something like Science Friday, which has a national radio presence, where you don't cover something pretty specific. I think that that's kind of one of the keys is that, finding the specificity and then going after that niche and knowing that that's really what the podcast medium right now is best at, and going after it. And then, in terms of other kind of audience building, or sort of I think there again, the answer is still specificity because the stories are interesting, the details are interesting. So I recently did an interview, for example, about a woman who studies foxes. and she's from Britain, and they have a big history with foxes. And so, I think generally maybe people who are not really interested in animal behavior might not be interested in that kind of an episode, but yet there are certain things that are very interesting about foxes. The fact that they've been around in our fables and our stories since, as long as we have reported history. So trying to kind of pull that specificity back into why this is important, why this affects every one of us in our daily lives, I think is one of the keys.
I wonder if you could just say a word about sort of luring the scientist out of their science cave where they have their very specific language. Maybe they have acronyms, jargon, big words. Do you have to sort of up front, off camera or off mic say, okay, coach them on, get a sort of a readability kind of, common audience framework? Or do you just sort of talk them down a few steps into the comfortable space? How do you do that?
So I find often I have the opposite problem. I think a lot of scientists know that they're not very well understood by the general public if they pop into jargon. So instead, they become very general and non-specific and therefore uninteresting, right? They start hedging and they start saying things that really are not that exciting. So I always tell them off mic that I'm a neuroscientist, but I'm still going to ask you things that are basic neuroscience questions because our audience needs to know them. But to leave it up to pull that in, tell them it's my job to make sure that what you're saying is going to be accessible rather than yours, and instead just try to encourage them to talk about their work. Okay. And then some scientists are better at that than others, but in general I find it's the opposite, that they speak in these big generalities that really that's not doing them any favors.
Great. Now I know from who I can see is attending this that we've got people who have comments or questions. Don't make me want to call on you, people. I also acknowledge that our first question came from Kishore Hari, who was a longtime co-host on Inquiring Minds. I don't know if you noticed that, Indra. So anyway, great to have Kishore on. Great. Okay, so I just want to underscore something you said in the second part of what you had to say, which is that I think that when people experience your podcast, either of your podcasts, it'll be like you make it look easy, and that's the danger. It's not easy, and it may sound like, oh, it's just two people having an easy conversation, but we've heard this before, and I would just say, particularly for an audience of funders who have the resources to do whatever they want, and they have obviously intellectual capital on site, having that sort of strong brand voice that you would need. It's not for every funder who has the resources to do it, who has the inherent sort of capability to make it work as a podcast. One that does work is We Can Be at the Heinz Endowments. Grant Oliphant is a great podcast host, but we had a presentation from Scott Roller, one of their senior communications team, on exactly what it takes to do that. What looks easy, sounds easy, takes a lot of resources. So it's just a sort of be careful, kids at home. Don't try this at home unless you really answer those other questions that you raised. So I appreciate that you acknowledge that as well, Andre. So not seeing any other. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to give you some numbers, like for us to put out a show, it takes about 10 hours of back-end work for that 1 hour or 45 minutes of podcast, even though it's lightly edited and, it sounds like it's just a conversation, but the prep work, for then, the actual recording, then the editing afterwards, I mean, it's at least 10 hours a week. When it comes to Cadence, my more heavily produced podcast, there it takes a year to do 8 to 10 episodes. So, gathering the interviews, writing the scripts, putting them all together. So that's just to give people, some perspective. It takes a lot of time.
Great. Can I just ask, do you have a favorite, or if somebody said, tell me which of your podcasts would be a great example for because there's 300. Do you have a favorite that you point people to?
Yeah, I have a couple of favorites. One of my more recent favorites, there are actually two back-to-back episodes. One's David Epstein, and the other one's David Robson. I call them the two Davids that I recorded this summer. And the first one is David Epstein talking about how generalists are often undervalued. He wrote a book called Range, and it was a really, I love talking to David because he and I have so many things in common in terms of what our interests are. But that really is about how sometimes, we become too specific in terms of the way that we train people, and sometimes being a generalist can actually put you ahead. And then the other side of the other David is the intelligence trap. So how sometimes, even when we're highly intelligent, we actually become fooled because we become fooled by our own intelligence. And so those are the kinds of stories that or individual topics that we pick, which for me, my sort of sweet spot is the intersection of neuroscience and then some kind of applicability to daily life.
Great. Well, your former co-host has a question. Kishore says, going back to your comment on audience, popular science podcasts seem to be dominated by groups that have existing networks, platforms, Science Friday, Pop Sci, or celebrity hosts, Neil Tyson, Bill Nye. Is there still room for independent science podcasts to succeed?
I think it's really hard. I think that a lot of upfront money would have to be put on to building the audience. And again, I think the question needs to be sort of, what is this podcast adding that these other podcasts that are highly successful not covering? And so when it comes to like a deep dive into a particular story, yes, I think that might be something that is worth doing. But then I think those podcasts will need to partner with another media organization. Let's say they want to do a special in-depth look into climate change, then maybe they should partner with the Washington Post or some other organization that has an audience that is going to promote their work, or exactly what the AP is looking at. So I think that that's important. But yeah, I think the era of like I'm just going to set up a mic in my garage and say interesting things, people are going to find me, is over, unfortunately.
Yeah, John, I saw you raise your hand. Do you want to come off mute and say a word?
I was just, I'm sorry, I was
just volunteering.
I was joking with Indra. She was talking about partnering with other media organizations, and I was just noticing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and certainly for funders who are thinking about this question, we'd be happy to help make connections with potential partners. There are myriad opportunities like that. One more question from Ben Carlson. Do you assume or know that a large proportion of your audience is in academia?
That's a good question. I actually are not. There is a small proportion, but actually a lot of the listeners that comment to us, that write to me in particular, are not academics. And that's one of the things I think they appreciate about our show. It gives them access to academics that they don't necessarily have elsewhere. Great.
Okay, well, thank you, Indra. And I think is it true you're shooting today in Washington?
Yeah, I'm at the Great Course right now, shooting a lecture series called How Technology is Shaping How We Think. So I'll have to pop off in a little bit and go record one more lecture.
Yeah, well, thanks for making time. We had to adjust the time of this event so that we could accommodate Indra's shooting schedule. So really appreciate having your voice on this webinar. We're going to turn to Rachel Strecker, who's Senior Director of Storytelling Grants, Programs, and Fellowships at the National Geographic Society. I think it's important particularly for our media philanthropy audience, to understand that National Geographic is not just a museum or a magazine or a television show, and obviously we all know that it's gone through in recent years some significant corporate restructuring, with the editorial activities moving over to a commercial partnership, which is now in conjunction with the Disney Corporation. But still, the storytelling remains central to the National Geographic. And people might be surprised to know that they're a very robust grant maker in this area too. And that's what Rachel leads, the work that Rachel leads there. And they're going to be hosting a really interesting event next month. And we're pleased to be participating with them in that. So Rachel, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Vince. And I'll just say, I think all the time about a lot of these issues, especially raised by Rich, thinking about going beyond preaching to the choir and what that looks like. And as you probably know, we've been telling stories about illuminating scientific discoveries and sort of sparking creativity about the world forever, really, since we started. And one thing people don't know as much about is that we've invested in science for a really long time. And so some of that magic comes from the intersection between the investments in both the scientists and the storytellers and seeing them come together. And so we have a lot of programs along that, working with scientists to help them build out their storytelling abilities and sort of vice versa. And I think a lot about what that means. I just found out from a researcher at Harvard that the two places where people have the most trust, particularly around science and climate change specifically, are people's personal doctors and medical care professionals and National Geographic. I would probably add local news, which is where John and AP kind of comes in, because that's where those really end up being super widespread. But I also think about, seeing one of our grantees on Nat Geo Wild, Ronan Donovan, talking about wolves, and then watching the commercials, which included like beer commercials and truck driving commercials, which really told me that here's this guy talking about wildlife biology and climate change to this population that isn't nor often getting those kinds of messages. But I will turn to our Storytelling Summit, because that's, I think, why I'm here, and I'm really excited about it. And just to say that at Society, we're really investing in those kinds of storytellers and the new generation of that. And our Storytelling Summit brings all of those people together, which tend to be some of the very best storytellers in the world, and a lot of new voices that you may not have heard before. That's going to be January 13th to 17th. The Monday and Tuesday, 13th and 14th, are really focused on training for our grantees and National Geographic Magazine photographers. But the day to kind of keep in mind as a funder and person who may be interested in really remarkable content and connecting with storytellers will be that Wednesday, the 15th. And there's a few things to be aware of. All the speakers on that day are going to be our grantees, and those include really people who run the gamut. We have Nirupa Rao, who's an incredible botanical illustrator, not something you see very much. Ian Urbina, who is a Pulitzer winner writer talking about oceans. We have Ronan Donovan, who I mentioned, who's a wildlife biologist turned photographer. And so you'll see some really incredible stuff. And then I'll also just flag that the Media Impact Funders is going to have a pre-conference basically on that day from 9 to, let me make sure I get the time right, 9 to 11:30. And so that's something that this audience really may be interested in. We're going to have some great speakers at that conference, really talking about this intersection of science and storytelling. And we're also going to be holding a lunch on that day with one of our partners, the Rita Allen Foundation. And that's going to have some incredible storytellers as well, including Anand Varma, who's a fabulous, bench scientist turned photographer. Brian Scarry, who's worked for the past, his entire career underwater and has been really focusing on whale culture in the past few years. And then, as I mentioned, Nirupa Rao will also be speaking there. So, and then if you want to stay, there's going to be the National Geographic magazines really gathering of some of the very best photographers in the world. And we actually kind of piggybacked off of them as a partner, and will be, and for this whole event, they've held that event for over 50 years. And it's been kind of the coming home of all of their photographers and storytellers. And they have an incredible lineup on that day as well. So that's just something to mark on your calendars. Let us know if that's something that may be interesting to you for attending. And we're really excited. I don't usually call things amazing. I think it's too much of a superlative, but it's a pretty amazing couple of days.
Well, it sounds exciting for sure. I will just underscore that gathering is a funder only gathering. We're doing the pre-conference session, and I think the lunch that Rita Allen is convening as well. We tend to be relatively open in sharing information with a broader audience, and this discussion will be available to people on a recording after today's webinar and before that event, but we don't want to heighten expectations. If you're not a funder, you can't join us for that piece.
That's really appreciated, Vince.
We do that. We try not to have a secret cabal kind of conversation over here. We share the information, but some of the things that we do are not open to all public participants. So, and we really are looking forward to sharing that special experience with our network of funders. We think that we'll do a lot to stimulate their understanding and interest in this area as well. We've got a couple of questions here, so let me see if we can get a question from Randy. Do you have specific advice for grant opportunities related to Nat Geo and potential convergence with any National Science Foundation funding sources? Not exactly sure how to interpret that, but Rachel, do you understand that?
Yeah, I'm not. Let me take a crack at it, and we can find out if I got it right. So our funding model is really to support individual storytellers to tell stories that we care about the most. I'm not sure about the National Science Foundation intersection. We do, as part of our funding, also support scientists, technologists, educators, other disciplines. Maybe the chat is, so let me know if I sort of got that right.
Well, we'll leave it to Randy to let us know if you've answered. I also want to invite any of our speakers to ask a question of each other. You might have the most interest in each other's work. Well, I'll just, in the meantime, I'll also ask Rachel, you've been part of the Storytelling Summit for how many years?
I'm relatively new, so I went to one last year, okay. and so that was my very first one.
Was there a highlight from last year that you would call out as an exemplary of what you see there? If it was amazing, is there anything specific that you would mention?
Oh gosh,
put you on the spot a little bit.
It is really, my head has been so steep in our next year's speakers, but I will say, as with our broader Explorers Festival, I think the magic really happens when you see the intersection and relationship building of our storytellers as they come together, and sort of the mentorship and work that happens together. I mean, I think part of it was we're really investing more in diversifying these fields and seeing people who come from often voices who are underrepresented in global media kind of coming together and making relationships was really magical. And so it was less the things that were on stage, which were completely remarkable, and but also just these connections that people made.
Great. Well, I'll just say I haven't been to the Storytellers Summit, but I was at the Explorers Summit, the event that you have in June a couple of years back, and recall a young woman who was one of, I think, your fellows, who was both a dancer with the Washington Ballet and an undersea diver, and the way that she sort of brought those two worlds together in her presentation was quite magical. Mm-hmm. So certainly looking forward to this summit as well.
Yeah.
Anything from each other to each of you to each other? Yeah, Rich.
Yeah, a quick question for Rachel. So the purpose of the Storytelling Summit, is that essentially to get funders to pay more attention to these particular storytellers, or are you trying to get their story out to the public?
Oh, it's a great question. As I said, the summit was started over 50 years ago, and it was driven by photographers. It actually wasn't organized by National Geographic. And it was just them saying, like, we really need some time to show each other our own work. We want to get together. And over the years, that has started to be supported more and driven more by National Geographic. Now, I would say it's a time for us to, in the spirit of that, bring all of our grantees and people that we support together. And sure, yeah, it's great to show their work to funders, but it's also, it's about driving those conversations and collaborations, which often do need funding, but also are driven directly by our explorers, which is what we call our grantees, and for those kinds of opportunities.
We have a couple of questions from Ben Carlson again. What do you think distinguishes the most successful science storytelling and storytellers? Any recipes or best practices to share? And I think that's actually a question that any of you might have insight on. Anybody want to raise their hand and jump in?
I can answer from a general news perspective. From a general news perspective, you almost have to trick people. You need to make it relatable to their lives, and character is often the way to do that. Tell stories through people. There's got to be some, in science stories, when there isn't, maybe an astronomy story, or maybe there isn't a character that we know of, or that we can interview. But there is, you can leverage the gee whiz. You want to be able to, you want to do stories that people are going to talk about at the dinner table, talk about at the, at the cocktail. But did you hear that did you know that that's the kind of stuff that the amazement of science can really work. And then certainly on the health and medical side, it's people. It's telling stories how people are experiencing healthcare, or a disease, or a recovery, or a new breakthrough.
Anyone else? Yeah, Indra.
Yeah, I would second that. It's actually one of the reasons why the second season of Cadence, my podcast about music and the mind, really took the approach of music as medicine, and we profiled 8 different stories of people, starting with their story and then delving into the science behind how music helped or hurt them, or what have you. But I would say that sometimes the scientist is the story, right? So sometimes how the scientist came to the discovery can make a good story. And I think that those stories are important to tell because it sort of demystifies the process of science, makes it more human. Kishore and I actually did a video series for Verve called Science in Progress, where the point was to show that scientists don't have this perfect recipe for finding something amazing. Often do use a lot of trial and error. There are often funny things that happen. There are serendipitous things that happen. And that, I think, is a really great way of sort of showing people that scientists are not weird, they're not, other. They're just like you and I, and they're, fumbling around in the dark a lot of the time too. And sometimes they come up with a really lucky or brilliant solution.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think what John and Indra know really well is that I think sometimes we think that science reporting has to be this niche issue, but in fact, humans are curious beings, and if you can kind of get out of the way of yourself in terms of the reporting and lean into that, we find that actually at National Geographic, I've been surprised to learn that some of the very most successful stories at the magazine and in the publication branches have been these scientific stories, and that people really do want to know about it, as long as it's presented in a way that's accessible and sparks that kind of that curiosity.
We were talking sort of around journalism and news, but also I think the Sloan Foundation has shown that science can also, the interest of science can also be sparked through characters. A lot of their support for popular media programming around science surrounds characters. That incredible movie with Benedict Cumberbatch on Alan Turing, the Imitation Game, the film they did about Hedy Lamarr, some larger than life characters for sure in science, and we get to the science through those characters too sometimes. We have a question from my colleague, Nina. As Indre said, scientists are often nervous about speaking about their work, and they're not always the best at communicating it. Knowing that delivering science information is difficult, I wonder what processes are on the journalism side for ensuring reporters are translating the content as accurately as possible. Does the AP treat these stories differently, whether it's with a different kind of fact-checking process or something else?
I wouldn't say differently, no. Yes, they are often more complex, more nuanced, and that's important, very important, obviously. I will say our team, that's why there's a special team. That's why there is a health and science team at the AP, at a lot of other places, because, it does take some, in some sense, you have to report, like any other reporter, you have to, question, you have to be curious, you have to probe. But there are there's some technical things, there's some complexities, absolutely, and that's why we have a special team. That we have a public health reporter who knows the CDC, people at the CDC and all the CDC data, and so that do we always get it right? We think so. Our reporters also know when they don't know enough, right? And that's important, right? To really question the scientist. So if I described it like this, would it be accurate? Really specific probing questions to make sure we get it right. It's very, very, it's our most important thing to get it right. It's most important for our sources. We're going to be calling these sources back. This is a daily news operation. We're going to be calling these sources back. We're going to want to work with them. We have responsibility to the material and to the reader. So nothing special, really, but it is sometimes a harder task.
Yeah, and again, you're the AP, so you have all that. But for funders and media outlets who might not have the kind of depth of bench to do the fact checking, whatever the fact, there is also a resource called Sciline that people might know about. It's a project of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We've heard from them in the past. They're an important resource that does help to backstop the scientific knowledge of the reporter to help them with that. And that is oftentimes connecting with academic resources and other knowledge that can backstop the journalist. The flip side of that is there's an organization called The Conversation. It's an international network, and they do the reverse of that, which is to go to the scientists and the academics in a variety of disciplines to help them be better storytellers, to convey their knowledge through journalism channels. So those are just a couple more resources for people to think about. Anybody else want to comment on that last question, Rich?
Yeah, I would just jump in to say, I think rather than fact checking, one of the biggest challenges is balance. So for the climate change debate, how much room should you give to climate change skeptics? When you're talking about a drug approval, a lot of scientists have pretty hefty potential conflicts there. So trying to navigate those waters can be quite difficult. And that's why, just to reemphasize what John said about having a deep bench of journalists who are, can draw on their experience and who are able to, focus on science, environment, and health. I think that helps give you a level of sophistication in your coverage that you wouldn't get if you're, say, a general assignment reporter being thrown onto a story, having a deadline to come up with it really quickly. Certainly factually correct story, but achieving balance is very, very tricky.
Very important point. Okay, as we come to the end of our webinar, we were talking about podcasts. This is not a podcast, but as we come to the end of our webinar, I just want to acknowledge that we've got this great opportunity for some of you to join us in Washington at the National Geographic Storytellers Summit next month. We also are going to be convening our Media Impact Forum on the topic of climate and the environment June 2nd in New York at the Ford Foundation. Stay tuned for more information about that. And we're going to be probably doing our journalism webinar on the topic of health and science, science so far as it relates to health journalism in March. Also stay tuned for more details about that webinar. And thank you all for joining us, panelists, and sneaking one last activity in before the holidays come. You've given us a lot to think about, maybe a lot to listen to. I'm looking forward to tuning into Cadence over the holidays, and looking forward to seeing you all in the new year. So thank you all, and goodbye.